The sound she made wasn't cruel on purpose. That's what I told myself for the first 3 days. Standing in our kitchen in Naperville, Illinois, with a glass of Pinot Grigio sweating in her left hand and her phone glowing in her right, my wife laughed. Not a giggle, not a nervous exhale, not the soft, sympathetic sound a person makes when they don't know what else to do. It was the laugh of recognition, the laugh that says, "I knew it," the laugh that lands in the center of your chest and stays there like a coin dropped into still water, sinking slowly, never quite reaching the bottom. I had just told her I lost my job. She set the wine glass down on the granite counter we'd argued about for 2 weeks before she won, the way she won everything, through persistence and the quiet implication that my preferences were smaller than hers. She looked at me once, a full scan, head to shoes and back again, the kind of look you give a receipt before you crumple it. "So what exactly is your plan, Elliot? Because I'm not carrying this house on my back while you figure out how to be useful again." She turned. She walked to the living room. I heard the television come on. I heard the couch accept her weight. I heard the nothing that followed. The specific, practiced nothing of a woman who had already decided this conversation was beneath the energy it would cost her to continue it. I stood in that kitchen for 11 minutes. I know because the digital clock on the microwave changed from 6:47 to 6:58 while I stood there holding a spatula I'd been using to make dinner. Red peppers sat half-chopped on the cutting board. An onion, peeled but untouched. Garlic crushed in the press but not yet scraped out. A meal for 2, planned by 1, abandoned in the middle because the person it was being made for had just made it clear that the man making it was no longer worth sitting across from. The overhead light buzzed. It had buzzed like that for 2 years, a faint electrical hum behind the fixture that I kept meaning to fix. I'd replaced the bulbs twice. I'd tightened the housing once. The buzz remained, patient and indifferent, the kind of small broken thing that exists in every home and that everyone agrees to ignore because fixing it would require someone to admit it was there. I set the spatula down. I scraped the garlic into the pan anyway. I finished the dinner. I plated it. I ate standing up at the counter because sitting at the table alone in a house where someone else was choosing not to join me felt like a concession I wasn't ready to make. The food was good. I say that without pride. It was just good. The peppers had the right char. The garlic didn't burn. Small, specific, ordinary victories that no one would ever know about, which, I was beginning to understand, was the story of my entire life. My name is Elliot Mercer. I'm 41 years old. I grew up in Joliet, Illinois, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner that has since become a nail salon, that has since become an empty storefront, with a for lease sign that's been in the window so long, the paper has turned yellow. My father, James Mercer, drove the Blue Line for the Chicago Transit Authority for 33 years. My mother, Lorraine, worked the front desk at a dental office in Plainfield until her arthritis made it too painful to type. Between them, they never made more than $110,000 combined in a single year, and between them they raised a son who believed, deeply and without evidence to the contrary, that love was something you earned through consistency, that if you showed up, stayed steady, built quietly, and never demanded credit, the people beside you would eventually turn and see what you had made and understand what it had cost. I was wrong about that. But the order in which I discovered how wrong and what I did with each discovery is the part that changes everything. I need to go back. Not to the beginning, because the beginning is just a man and a woman meeting at a fundraiser and none of what matters has happened yet. I need to go back to the middle, the thick, unglamorous, uncinematic middle where most of a life actually takes place. I met Vanessa in the spring of 2011 at a charity event for a children's literacy nonprofit on the north side of Chicago. She was 25. I was 27. She worked in pharmaceutical sales for a company whose name she dropped 3 times in our first conversation, each time watching my face to see if it registered. It did, but only because I was watching her watch me, and even then I mistook her performance for passion. She had just leased her first BMW. She mentioned this within 4 minutes of shaking my hand. Not aggressively, not with vulgarity, but with the practiced casualness of someone who had rehearsed how to make an achievement sound accidental. She wore a navy blazer and heels that clicked on the hardwood floor with the metronomic precision of someone who had practiced walking in them until the practice disappeared. I was a data analyst at a mid-sized logistics company called Trask Distribution, making $58,000 a year. I drove a 2006 Honda Civic with a slow leak in the rear left tire that I filled every Tuesday morning at the Shell station on Ogden Avenue. I owned one good suit. I was wearing it. She was magnetic. I will not pretend otherwise because pretending would be dishonest, and I have spent enough of my life being honest to people who didn't return the favor that I owe it to myself now. Vanessa had the kind of energy that reorganized a room. Not warmth exactly, but force. Direction. The feeling that wherever she was standing was the front of the room, and if you happened to be standing near her, you were closer to something important. People moved toward her the way iron filings move toward a magnet, not by choice but by physics. I moved too. I just happened to be the filing she picked up and kept. We dated for 2 years. We married in the fall of 2013 in a small ceremony at a venue in the western suburbs. 62 guests, her side mostly. My mother sat in the second row and cried quietly and completely, the way she did everything with total commitment and zero performance. Vanessa's mother, Carol, sat in the front row. She was a tall woman with excellent posture and the particular kind of beauty that comes from decades of disciplined maintenance. A woman who understood that appearance was a form of argument and had never once lost the case. During the reception, she told at least 3 people, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly far enough that Vanessa could have done better. She said it warmly. She said it with a smile. She said it the way a person slides a knife between your ribs while complimenting your shirt. Vanessa heard her say it twice. She never corrected her. Not that night. Not ever. Psychologists call this ambient devaluation. It is not a single event. It is a climate. A persistent atmospheric condition in which one person's worth is kept at a controlled low temperature. Never cold enough to cause an obvious crisis. Never warm enough to allow genuine comfort. The recipient adjusts. They put on layers. They stop noticing the chill because the chill is all they've known. And the most dangerous thing about a room that's always cold is that eventually you stop shivering. You think that means you've adapted. It means you've gone numb. We moved to Naperville in 2015, a 4-bedroom colonial on Washington Street with a wraparound porch and a yard big enough that mowing it took most of a Saturday morning. Vanessa chose the house. I chose to make Vanessa happy. Those are not the same thing, but it took me 6 years to learn the difference, and by then the mortgage had become a fact, and facts are harder to undo than feelings. I worked at Trask. I was promoted in 2016. Again in 2018, a 3rd time in 2020. By the time the world went strange and quiet that spring, I was Senior Director of Logistics Intelligence, managing a team of 11 analysts, pulling $127,000 a year plus a modest bonus that arrived each March like a small, apologetic gift from a company that knew it was underpaying me, but hoped the consistency would keep me from noticing. $127,000. It was more money than any single person in my family had ever made in a salaried position. My mother cried when I told her about the promotion. My father, who had passed the year before, would have said something quiet and specific and exactly right, the way he always did, and then changed the subject to the Cubs because that was how James Mercer processed pride, by letting it exist without making it perform. It wasn't enough. Not for Vanessa. Not for Carol, who had a habit of asking during holiday dinners whether I'd thought about business school with the same gentle, lethal concern you'd use to ask someone if they'd thought about getting a mole checked. And not for Vanessa's brother, Terrence, who ran a real estate brokerage in Schaumburg and drove a Range Rover and asked me every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every 4th of July backyard gathering whether I had ever considered, and I'm quoting him directly, getting into something with actual upside. I smiled every time he said it. I passed the potato salad. I let it go. I let all of it go, year after year, holiday after holiday, because I loved his sister, and I believed that love was a room you stayed in even when the furniture was uncomfortable, because leaving meant admitting that the room was the problem, and I wasn't ready to admit that, not yet. What none of them knew, what no one on this planet knew except for 2 people, was that in the fall of 2017 I had begun building something in the dark. It started the way most important things start, by accident and without ambition. A colleague at Trask named Dennis Okafor asked me to look at a dataset for a friend's startup, a logistics optimization platform aimed at regional trucking companies that couldn't afford enterprise-level analytics. I spent a weekend in the guest room with the door closed, restructuring their data model, cleaning their inputs, rebuilding their forecasting algorithm from a set of assumptions so flawed I was surprised the company had lasted 6 months. The results were clean. Genuinely, surprisingly clean. The kind of clean that made Dennis's friend, a man named Kwame, call me on a Sunday evening and offer to pay me $2,500 for what I had done in 2 days. I said no at first. Then I thought about it for a week. Then I said yes. Then 3 more calls came. Then 5. Then the calls stopped being favors and started being work. In January 2018, I filed incorporation papers for a consulting LLC under the name Blackwell Analytics. I registered it to a P.O. box in downstate Illinois. The operating agreement listed my middle name, James, and my mother's name, Lorraine, as the registered agent. She didn't fully understand what the company did. She understood completely why I wasn't telling anyone about it, and she never asked me to explain. That was the deal between us, unspoken and absolute. She held the secret the way she held everything I gave her, carefully, patiently, and without needing to be told it was important. The work grew the way things grow when you water them at night where no one can see, not explosively, not virally. One client at a time, almost always through referrals, regional freight companies, cold chain logistics firms, a few agricultural cooperatives in central Illinois that had been running on spreadsheets held together with duct tape and institutional memory, and needed someone to come in and build an actual system. I worked between 9 at night and 1 in the morning most nights, sometimes later. After Vanessa went to bed, after the house settled into its particular nighttime silence, the tick of the hallway clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the porch in the wind. I sat at my laptop in the guest room, or sometimes at the kitchen table under that buzzing light, and I built something that had no name anyone would recognize and no shape anyone would notice, and that was, for a long time, exactly what I needed it to be. Vanessa never asked what I was doing. She assumed it was work email, overflow from Trask. The harmless, tedious digital labor of a man whose job she had already categorized as administrative. She didn't ask because the answer, in her framework, couldn't possibly be interesting. And I didn't offer because I had learned, slowly and irreversibly, that offering things to people who have already decided you have nothing worth offering is its own quiet form of self-destruction. By the end of 2019, Blackwell Analytics had 9 active clients. Revenue had reached $145,000 annually. I deposited none of it into our joint accounts. Every dollar flowed through the LLC into a trust I had established with a financial attorney in Springfield named Ruth Adler, a woman in her early 60s who had been managing small business trusts for 3 decades and who believed with the conviction of someone who had seen the alternative that discretion was not deception, but the most responsible form of self-preservation available to a person who had learned the hard way that not everyone who sleeps beside you is on your side. My mother was the trustee. She held the accounts in her name. She understood, without my ever needing to say it explicitly, that what I was building was not a secret born of dishonesty, but a structure born of necessity. The people closest to me had spent years making it clear what they believed I was worth. I had simply decided, quietly and without announcement, that they were wrong, and I was going to prove it on my own timeline, in my own way, in the hours no one was watching. Psychologists describe this as compensatory building, the phenomenon in which a consistently undervalued individual redirects their energy into a domain where their contributions cannot be dismissed, minimized, or attributed to someone else. It is not revenge. It is the construction of a parallel self, a version of the person that exists entirely outside the framework others have imposed on them. The parallel self doesn't need permission. It doesn't need applause. It needs only time, discipline, and a door that closes. By 2022, Blackwell Analytics had 19 active clients across 6 states. Annual revenue had crossed $400,000. The trust, combined with investment returns that Ruth Adler had managed with the quiet ferocity of a woman who took fiduciary duty personally, held just over $1.4 million in total assets. I was, by any objective measure, wealthy, and I went to work every morning at Trask Distribution and came home every evening to a house where my wife asked me to take out the recycling, and her mother called on Sundays to ask whether I'd given any more thought to doing something meaningful with my career. I took out the recycling, I listened to Carol, I smiled at Terrence. I kissed Vanessa on the forehead before bed, and then I waited for the house to go dark, and I opened my laptop, and I kept building. Now, the layoff. September, a Thursday. The air outside had that particular early autumn quality, still warm but with a warning underneath, the light starting to angle lower, the shadows starting to arrive earlier, the whole season tilting slowly toward something colder. Trask Distribution had been acquired 6 weeks earlier by a larger logistics conglomerate out of Atlanta called Ridgeline Partners. The transition had been smooth on paper and disorienting in practice. New email systems, new reporting structures, new people in glass offices who smiled with professional warmth and remembered nobody's name. My division, Logistics Intelligence, was absorbed into Ridgeline's existing analytics department. The overlap was obvious. The redundancy was structural. The outcome was inevitable. I was called into a conference room at 2:15 in the afternoon. An HR representative I had never met before sat across from me with a folder and a laptop and the careful, compassionate expression of someone who delivers bad news professionally and has learned to make the compassion arrive before the content so the recipient has a moment to brace. "The company values your contributions," she said, "and we wish you well going forward. 14 years. 3 promotions. A clean record. A team of 11 people who sent me a cake on my birthday last year with a note that said, 'You're the reason we don't hate Mondays.' All of it reduced to a sentence, a handshake, and a cardboard box. I packed the box in my office with the door closed. A desk lamp. A framed photo of my mother standing in front of the Joliet apartment, squinting into the sun with her hand shading her eyes, looking exactly like a woman who had never once needed anyone to tell her she was strong. A coffee mug my team had given me 2 Christmases ago. It said "World's Most Adequate Data Guy," which had made everyone laugh for reasons that had more to do with affection than accuracy. I wrapped the mug in a spare shirt so it wouldn't break. Then I carried the box to the elevator, rode down to the parking garage and placed it in the passenger seat of my car with a care that, looking back, was probably the first stage of grief disguised as practicality. I sat in the driveway at home for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the way you watch something when you need an external reference point to confirm that time is still passing. The house looked exactly the way it always looked. Brick and white trim and the black mailbox by the door, and the hydrangeas along the front walk that Vanessa had planted 3 summers ago, and that I had watered every Tuesday and Friday since because she had planted them, and then immediately lost interest in whether they lived or died. I went inside. Vanessa was in the kitchen. The wine was already open. I told her. She laughed. I want to stay in this moment a little longer because it is the hinge on which the entire story turns, and hinges deserve to be examined closely. The laugh lasted approximately 2.5 seconds. It was not theatrical. It was not prolonged. It rose from somewhere involuntary and arrived on her face before she could organize it into something more appropriate, which means it was honest, which means it was the truest thing she had communicated to me in years. What the laugh said, translated from the language of a decade of ambient devaluation, was this: of course. Of course this happened. Of course the man I married, the man my mother warned me about, the man my brother pities, the man whose career I've been quietly ashamed of since before I was willing to admit I was ashamed. Of course that man just confirmed every quiet judgment I've been carrying. The layoff didn't surprise her. It completed her. Psychologists call this confirmation bias in intimate relationships. When one partner maintains a fixed internal narrative about the other, every piece of incoming data is filtered through that narrative. Evidence that contradicts the story is discarded, minimized, or reinterpreted. Evidence that supports it is absorbed, amplified, and stored. Over time, the person being perceived doesn't need to do anything wrong. They simply have to exist inside someone else's shrinking frame. The frame does the rest. She set the glass down. She said the words about not carrying the house on her back. She left the kitchen, and I stood there under the buzzing light with half-chopped peppers and a spatula and a box in the car that contained everything I had to show for 14 years of showing up, and I felt something I had never felt before in that house. Not sadness, not anger. A kind of thermal shift, like a wall I'd been leaning against for years had quietly dissolved and I was still standing. But the architecture around me had changed completely, and every surface I touched from this point forward would feel different under my hands. I slept in the guest room that night. Not because she asked me to, though she didn't ask me not to, which was its own kind of answer. I slept there because the guest room was where my laptop lived, and my laptop was where Blackwell lived, and Blackwell was the only place in that house where I was not small. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly before you answer. Have you ever been in a room with someone who was supposed to love you and felt more alone than you would have felt by yourself? Have you ever watched someone look at you and known with the absolute cellular certainty that lives below language that they were not seeing you, that they were seeing a version of you they had built years ago, a simplified, diminished, convenient version, and that no amount of evidence would ever be enough to update their model? If you have, then you already understand what happened next. And if you haven't, stay with me anyway, because what Elliot does from this point forward is not about revenge. It is about the moment a man who spent a decade being invisible decides, without announcement, without drama, without raising his voice even once, that he is done being unseen. The next morning I was awake at 5:30. I made coffee in the French press I'd used every morning for 6 years, the one with the cracked handle I'd repaired twice with marine epoxy, the one Vanessa had offered to replace 4 times, and that I kept declining because there was something in the crack, in the repair, in the visible evidence of use and care that felt more like mine than anything new ever could. I stood at the kitchen window. The yard was still dark. A rabbit sat motionless near the back fence, its outline just barely visible in the pre-dawn gray. I watched it for a long time. Maybe because it was alive and still and present, and not asking me to be anything other than the person watching it. Vanessa came downstairs at 7:15 dressed for work, heels, structured bag over her shoulder, hair pulled back in the way she wore it when she wanted to signal competence, which was every day, which was always. She poured coffee into a travel mug without looking at me, not with hostility, with absence. The way you navigate around a piece of furniture you've already decided to replace. "I've been thinking," she said, still not looking at me. "I'm going to call my mother this weekend. We need to figure out what this looks like going forward. Financially." She said the word financially the way a structural engineer says load-bearing, with the implication that something might collapse and that the structure in question was me. Then she picked up her bag, adjusted her collar in the hallway mirror, and left. The front door closed with the soft, definitive click of a woman who believed she had just set the terms of whatever came next. I sat at the counter and drank my coffee and let the house settle back into silence and thought about a word my father used to use: underestimate. He didn't use it as a warning. He used it as a weather report. People are going to underestimate you, Elliot. That's not a problem. That's a head start. That afternoon, sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Walgreens 3 blocks from my house, because I did not want to have this conversation inside walls that might carry my voice upstairs or through vents or into the wrong silence, I opened my laptop and checked the Blackwell Analytics inbox. 3 new emails. The first was from a cold storage logistics company in Memphis called Pinnacle Cold Chain. Their operations director, a woman named Sandra Chen, had been referred by a mutual client. She wanted to discuss what she described as a full-scale data infrastructure overhaul across 14 regional facilities. Preliminary scope suggested a contract between $350,000 and $500,000 over 18 months. She had attached a 12-page operational summary and a note that said, "We've talked to 4 firms. You're the first one a client told us to trust. The second email was a contract renewal from an agricultural cooperative in Peoria. Straightforward. $38,000 for another year. I'd done their work the previous year in 9 days. They thought it would take 3 months. They had sent a handwritten thank you note through the P.O. box, which my mother had forwarded to me in a larger envelope that also contained 2 packs of peppermint gum and a newspaper clipping about a dog that had learned to open doors, because that was how Lorraine Mercer communicated love, through logistics. The third email stopped me. It was from a man named Arthur Devereaux, Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending at First Meridian Bank. The tone was measured and careful, the way institutional language sounds when a bank is trying to be personal without being presumptuous. Mr. Blackwell, the email read, "Your financial portfolio and recent business activity have come to the attention of our commercial banking division through a routine quarterly account review. The growth trajectory and client diversification reflected in your accounts suggest that your current banking relationship may not be fully serving your needs. We would welcome the opportunity to discuss an expanded private banking arrangement at your earliest convenience. Please contact my office directly." I read it 3 times. Each time the words meant something slightly different, the way a landscape changes depending on the light. The first time they were information. The second time they were confirmation. The third time, they were something closer to what my father might have called a reckoning, the moment the world's math finally catches up with your own. I closed the laptop. I looked out the windshield at the parking lot. A woman was loading bags into her trunk. A man in a reflective vest was collecting shopping carts. A pigeon walked in a small purposeful circle near a storm drain, committed to a task only it understood. I called Arthur Devereaux. Arthur was the kind of man whose voice told you everything before his words did. Mid-50s, steady, unhurried, the vocal equivalent of a well-maintained building. Someone who had been doing important work long enough that the importance no longer made him nervous. He confirmed what the email had suggested. First Meridian's quarterly compliance review had flagged the Blackwell Analytics Trust accounts. The deposits, the growth pattern, the geographic diversification, the retention rate of clients, all of it had triggered an internal threshold that automatically elevated the account from standard commercial services to the bank's private wealth division. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, or perhaps I should say Mr. Mercer, "since our compliance team has completed the beneficial ownership verification, your current combined holdings across the LLC, the trust, and the associated investment accounts place you in our top 40 clients in the state of Illinois. We'd like to assign you a dedicated private banking team and discuss portfolio strategies appropriate to your position." I sat in the Walgreens parking lot and listened to a man I'd never met tell me I was one of the wealthiest people at his bank, and I felt a strange telescopic sensation, as if I were watching my own life from a very great distance and only now understanding the shape of it. We agreed to meet the following Tuesday at First Meridian's private client offices in the West Loop. He suggested morning. I agreed. I hung up. I sat for another 4 minutes and watched the parking lot empty in the late afternoon light. Then I drove home and made dinner and ate it alone and went to the guest room and did not open my laptop, because for one night, just one, I wanted to sit with the weight of what was happening without adding anything to it. The weekend arrived like weather. Vanessa's mother, Carol, came to the house on Saturday afternoon. She let herself in with the key Vanessa had given her years ago, a key I had never been consulted about, and that Carol used with the proprietary confidence of a woman who believed access was the same thing as ownership. She found me in the kitchen. I was cleaning the stove. She set her purse on the counter, looked at me the way she always looked at me, which was down, regardless of the fact that I was 4 inches taller than her, and said, "Elliot, sweetheart, we need to talk about your situation." My situation? Not your job. Not what happened. My situation, the language of diagnosis, the language of a problem to be managed rather than a person to be supported. She sat at the kitchen table. Vanessa appeared from somewhere, leaned against the counter behind her mother with her arms crossed, forming a configuration I had seen many times before. The two of them on one side of an invisible line, me on the other, the architecture of an intervention conducted by people who had already decided the outcome. Carol spoke for 14 uninterrupted minutes. She had a plan. She always had a plan. Vanessa would assume primary responsibility for the mortgage. I would file for unemployment immediately. Terrence had a contact at a staffing agency in Schaumburg who could place me in an entry-level logistics coordinator role, temp to hire, with benefits after 90 days if performance reviews were satisfactory. And in the meantime, Carol said, leaning forward slightly and lacing her fingers together on the table in the posture of a woman delivering a quarterly earnings report to a board that was already thinking about succession planning, perhaps it would be helpful for everyone if I understood clearly that Vanessa had options, that no one, Carol emphasized, would blame her for exploring them. She said that last sentence looking directly at me. Her smile was small and precise and entirely without warmth, a piece of punctuation that ended a paragraph she had written long before she arrived. Vanessa stood behind her mother with her arms folded and did not disagree. She did not nod. She did not shake her head. She simply stood in the particular silence of a woman who has allowed someone else to say the thing she didn't want to say herself and has decided that proximity is the same as plausible deniability. I listened to every word. I did not interrupt. I did not tighten my jaw or raise my voice or shift in my chair or do any of the things that the version of me they had constructed in their minds was expected to do. I simply sat with my hands folded and my back straight and looked at Carol the way you look at rain through a window, acknowledging its presence without granting it authority. When she finished, I said, "Thank you, Carol. I appreciate your concern. I'll think about everything you've said." She blinked, once, twice. The mechanical recalibration of a woman whose script had accounted for argument, for defensiveness, for the particular male fragility she believed she was managing, and had not accounted for stillness. Psychologists call this expectation disruption. When a person has prepared for a specific emotional reaction and receives composure instead, the result is a brief but significant cognitive disruption. The power dynamic shifts, not because the calm person has said anything dominant, but because they have refused to participate in the emotional choreography the other person was depending on. Carol had arrived expecting to manage Elliot's reaction. She left having managed only her own confusion. Vanessa walked her mother to the door 20 minutes later. I was still in the kitchen. I could hear them in the foyer, voices low, but not low enough. Carol's voice, warm and certain. "He's not going to fight for anything, Nessa. That's always been his problem." Vanessa's voice, quiet and flat. "I know, Mom. I know." The front door closed. Vanessa's heels clicked down the hallway toward the stairs. She did not return to the kitchen. She did not check on me. I heard the bedroom door close upstairs with the soft, decisive sound of a woman who had just confirmed, out loud, and to her mother, that the man she married was exactly as small as she needed him to be, in order to do what she was planning to do next. I sat at the kitchen table. The stove gleamed. The overhead light buzzed. And something inside me finished a sentence it had been writing for a very long time. Not anger. Not grief. Something colder and more structural. Clarity. The particular irreversible clarity of a man who has just heard, through a wall, the full and honest opinion of the people he organized his entire life around, and has realized, with the calm that only comes after you have already survived the worst part, that the worst part was not the hearing. The worst part was the years he spent making himself quiet enough to be overheard. Tuesday morning, 9:15. I pulled into the parking structure beneath First Meridian Bank's private client offices in the West Loop. The building was limestone and glass, the kind of architecture that communicates wealth not through ornamentation, but through restraint, the absence of anything unnecessary, which is, when you think about it, the most expensive aesthetic there is. A receptionist in the lobby offered me sparkling water. I accepted it because my mouth was dry, and because no receptionist had ever offered me sparkling water before, and I wanted to know what it felt like to be the kind of man who was offered sparkling water in a lobby. It felt like water, but the offering itself felt like something else entirely. Arthur Devereaux met me on the 7th floor, corner office, windows on two sides, a view of the river to the east and the skyline to the north. He wore a navy suit without a tie, and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead in the way of men who need them constantly, but prefer to believe they're optional. He shook my hand with the measured warmth of someone who understands that first impressions in private banking are not about friendliness but about trust, and that trust begins with the quality of your attention. We sat. He opened a leather portfolio. He walked me through the numbers with the calm, methodical care of a man who has delivered this particular kind of news many times, and understands that the recipient needs time to adjust, not to the information, but to the version of themselves the information implies. Blackwell Analytics LLC, combined with the family trust under Lorraine Mercer's name and the diversified investment accounts managed by Ruth Adler, placed my total verified net worth at $214 million. He said the number once. He did not repeat it. He let it sit in the room the way you let a large piece of furniture settle into a space, giving it time to belong. $2.14 million. Built between 9 at night and 1 in the morning. Built in a guest room, at a kitchen table, in a Walgreens parking lot. Built in the hours no one was watching by a man no one thought was building anything. Built not in spite of the underestimation but because of it. Because the underestimation had created a space, a vast, quiet, unmonitored space, and I had filled it with work. Arthur slid a second folder across the desk. Inside, a proposal for a full private wealth management relationship, a dedicated banking team, commercial credit lines calibrated to Blackwell's growth trajectory, and investment strategies appropriate to what he described, with a small, careful smile, as a client of significant standing. He looked at me over his glasses. "You've built something genuinely remarkable, Mr. Mercer, and you've done it with a discipline and a discretion that, frankly, I don't encounter often. Most people in your position want recognition. You didn't. That tells me more about your character than any financial statement ever could." I told him the truth. I said, "The people closest to me spent a long time making it very clear what they believed I was worth. I decided I didn't need their assessment to be the final one. I just needed time, and I had a lot of time. Mostly between 9 at night and 1 in the morning." Arthur nodded slowly. He closed the portfolio. He offered me more sparkling water. I accepted. We talked for another 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with what money means when you've earned it in silence, how it changes the way you hold yourself, how it doesn't change the way you feel, how the gap between the two is where most of the real work happens. When I left the building, I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the river. A boat moved slowly east. The water was green and flat and patient, carrying everything forward without commentary. I breathed. Just breathed. And for the first time since a Thursday afternoon in September, when an HR representative I'd never met shook my hand and wished me well, I felt something that wasn't loss or defiance or grief. It was solidity, the feeling of standing on ground you built yourself, with materials no one gave you on a timeline no one approved. That same week, 3 things happened. First, Vanessa's brother Terrence called me directly. He was loud, warm, and confident in the way of men who have spent their entire careers convincing people to buy things. He told me he'd secured a placement for me at a logistics staffing agency in Schaumburg. $19 an hour, temp to hire, possible benefits after 90 days, pending satisfactory performance reviews. He described it as a landing pad. He said it's not glamorous, Elliot, but it's a paycheck. And right now, you need a paycheck more than you need your pride. I thanked him. I told him I'd think about it. He said don't think too long, and hung up with the sound of a man checking a task off a list. Second, Sandra Chen at Pinnacle Cold Chain sent a formal letter of intent, $425,000 over 18 months, with a performance bonus structure that could push the total above $500,000. She included a handwritten note on company letterhead. It said, "My operations team has never seen a preliminary diagnostic this clean. We're looking forward to working with you." Third, I came home on a Wednesday evening and found papers on the kitchen table. Not my papers, Vanessa's. A printed email from a family law attorney named Richard Howe. The email was dated 10 days earlier, which meant she had contacted him before the layoff, before Carol's visit, before any of it. The subject line read, Preliminary Asset Assessment Mercer. Beneath the email, a printed worksheet. My name, my Trask salary history, my 401k balance, the estimated equity in the house, a column labeled Projected Settlement Range. The total at the bottom, circled in blue ink, $340,000. And beneath the worksheet, a handwritten note in Carol's looping, confident script. Better to move now while he has nothing to negotiate with. Don't wait. I stood at that table for a very long time. The overhead light buzzed. The same buzz. The same kitchen. The same counter where she had stood with her wine and her laugh and her flat, appraising scan. Everything was the same, and everything was completely, permanently, irreversibly different. I picked up each document. I read every word. I read Carol's note 3 times. Better to move now while he has nothing to negotiate with. The sentence was so clean, so efficient, so perfectly stripped of any acknowledgement that the he in question was a human being who had loved her daughter for over a decade, that it almost felt professional, which, I understood in that moment, was exactly what it was. Carol didn't hate me. She had simply never promoted me from a category she had filed me in the day we met. The category of temporary, the category of insufficient, the category of a man who could be replaced once a better option was identified, and the timing was right. The layoff wasn't the cause of the divorce. It was the starting pistol. Psychologists call this predatory timing, the strategic initiation of a separation at the precise moment the target is most financially and emotionally vulnerable. The goal is not merely to end the marriage, but to end it in a configuration that maximizes advantage for the initiator and minimizes the target's capacity to respond. It is most effective against people who have been systematically underestimated, because the underestimation itself becomes the weapon. If you have spent years convincing someone they are small, you don't expect them to have anything large to fight back with. I photographed every document with my phone. Every page, every line, Carol's note, Richard Howe's email, the asset worksheet with its tidy blue circle around $340,000, the number they had decided I was worth. I placed everything back on the table in exactly the position I had found it. I went to the guest room. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room where I had built a $2 million company, while my wife slept one wall away, and I called Ruth Adler. Ruth, I said, I need you to prepare a full financial disclosure packet for Blackwell Analytics and the Associated Trust. Every account, every contract, every asset, every dollar. Verified by forensic accountant. I want it ready within 10 days. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that holds a decade of understanding. Is it time? She asked. Yes, I said. It's time. I retained my own attorney the next morning, Jacqueline Osei, a family law specialist who worked out of a small firm in Oak Park. She had been recommended by Ruth, who described her as the kind of lawyer who speaks softly and carries documentation. She was in her late 40s, wore reading glasses she never took off, and had the particular calm of a person who has spent 2 decades in rooms where people are falling apart and has learned that the most useful thing she can offer is not emotion, but architecture. I sat in her office for 2 hours. I told her everything. The marriage, the ambient devaluation, the layoff, the laugh, Carol's plan, Richard Howe's worksheet, and then the part that made her set her pen down and look at me over her glasses with an expression I will never forget. I told her about Blackwell Analytics. The LLC, the trust, the clients, the revenue, the $2.14 million in verified assets that no one in my marriage, no one in my wife's family, and no one on their legal team knew existed. The room was very quiet when I finished. Jacqueline picked up her pen again. She wrote a single line on her legal pad. She turned it toward me so I could read it. They're going to walk into that room expecting to divide $340,000. You're going to present them with $2.14 million they didn't know existed, held in structures they've never seen, earned during a marriage in which you were consistently told you weren't enough. She paused. I've been doing this for 22 years, Mr. Mercer. I have seen every kind of surprise a courtroom can produce. This is the first time I've seen someone build an entire empire as a direct consequence of being underestimated by the people who were supposed to love him. She looked at me steadily. We're not going to use this as a weapon. We're going to use it as a mirror. We're going to walk into that mediation and show them exactly what they were looking at for 11 years and couldn't see. And then we're going to let the math do the talking. The mediation was scheduled for a Friday in late October, LaSalle Street. A law office on the 14th floor with a view of the Board of Trade and conference room chairs that cost more than most people's first cars. I know this because I looked them up later. $1,100 each. I was sitting in one and thinking about my mother's kitchen chairs, the ones with the vinyl cushions that stuck to your legs in summer, and how I had done some of my best thinking in those chairs, and how no amount of Italian leather would ever replicate what it felt like to sit at that table in Joliet, while my mother handed me pie and didn't ask a single question she didn't already know the answer to. It rained that morning. Chicago in late October, gray and committed, the rain falling with the steady institutional persistence of a city that has been doing this for a very long time and feels no need to vary the routine. I arrived at 9:45, dark gray suit, white shirt, my father's cufflinks, the ones my mother had given me after he passed, small silver rectangles with his initials engraved so finely you had to hold them close to read them. I sat at the conference table and folded my hands and looked out the window at the rain on the glass and the city beyond it, blurred and gray and enormous and indifferent, and I waited. At 10 o'clock the door opened. Vanessa walked in first, navy suit, the good one, the Michigan Avenue one, the one reserved for what she called high-stakes rooms. Her posture was immaculate. Her expression was the expression she wore when she believed she was about to close something. It was the face of a woman who had already written the last page of this story, and was simply here to watch the other characters arrive at the ending she had composed. Richard Howe followed. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of attorney who broadcasts competence through tailoring. He carried a leather binder and the quiet confidence of a man who had done the math and found it favorable. Carol came next. She had no legal reason to be there. She sat in a chair against the wall behind Vanessa, purse in her lap, the posture of a woman attending a performance she had helped produce. Terrence arrived last. He stood near the door with his arms folded, leaning against the wall, radiating the energy of a man who had been cast in the role of enforcer and was pleased with the assignment. The mediator, a retired family court judge named Helen Park, sat at the head of the table, court reporter in the corner, 6 glasses of water on the table. Nobody touched them. Richard Howe opened his folder. He laid out the terms with the practiced, unhurried cadence of a man presenting a case he considered already won. Even split of house equity. Vanessa retains her retirement accounts. I retain mine. No alimony, given my current lack of employment and limited earnings history. He pushed a document across the table and called it a fair and equitable resolution. The word fair sat in the air like a counterfeit bill. Jacqueline let 3 seconds pass. She did not look at the document. She looked at Richard Howe, then at Vanessa, then at the mediator. Before my client responds to this proposal, she said, I would like to enter into the record a supplemental financial disclosure that was not included in the respondent's initial filing, as the respondent was not previously aware of its existence. She placed a single bound document in the center of the table. 44 pages. Navy cover. My name on the front in plain type. This is the complete financial summary for Blackwell Analytics LLC, a data analytics consulting firm founded by Mr. Mercer in 2017 and operated continuously throughout the duration of the marriage. The document includes the articles of organization, client contract history, revenue and expense summaries for each fiscal year, trust documentation, investment account statements, and a current net asset valuation prepared and certified by a forensic accountant retained by our office. She opened to the summary page. She turned the document so it faced Vanessa's side of the table. As of this month, Mr. Mercer's total verified net worth, inclusive of the Blackwell operating accounts, the family trust held under his mother's name, and the diversified investment portfolio managed through a licensed fiduciary is $2,140,000. She said the number once, clearly, without emphasis. The way you state a fact that does not require your belief in order to be true. The room changed, not loudly, not dramatically. It changed the way a photograph changes when you adjust the exposure. Everything that was already there suddenly visible at a different intensity. Shadows became shapes. Shapes became structures. Structures became the architecture of a life no one in that room had bothered to look at closely enough to see. Carol's mouth opened. It did not close. Her hands tightened on her purse straps with the reflexive grip of a woman who has just felt the ground shift beneath a chair she assumed was bolted to the floor. Terrence unfolded his arms. He took one step forward, then stopped. The enforcer with nothing to enforce. Richard Howe picked up the document. He began reading with the rapid, compressed focus of a man who has just realized that the case he prepared was built on a foundation of assumptions, and that every single assumption was wrong. Vanessa did not move. She sat with her hands flat on the table, palms down as though holding herself in place. Her eyes moved to the summary page. She read the number. She read it again. She looked at the client list, the revenue columns, the year-over-year growth chart that climbed steadily upward like a staircase built by someone who understood that every step had to hold weight. Then she looked up at me. And this is the moment I want to stay in. Because this is the moment where two versions of a man, the one she had built and the one I had built, stood in the same room and she had to choose which one was real. The man she had laughed at in the kitchen, the man her mother had dismissed, the man her brother had offered $19 an hour. That man, the insufficient man, the small man, the man whose situation needed managing. That man had been sitting in the next room building something worth $2.14 million while she watched television and believed she had already seen everything there was to see. Her face did something I had never witnessed in 11 years. It became unguarded, not angry, not humiliated, not defensive. Open. The performance dissolved. The framework collapsed. And beneath it, for the first time, I saw something I had always suspected was there and had never been allowed to reach. A woman who was afraid. Afraid not of me, but of the realization that she had organized her entire marriage around a version of me that did not exist, and that the evidence of her error was now sitting in front of her, bound and certified and 44 pages long. Psychologists call this a schema collapse, the moment when the mental model a person has been using to navigate a relationship is confronted with evidence so comprehensive that repair is impossible. The model doesn't bend. It breaks. And the person is left standing in the rubble, seeing the landscape clearly for the first time and understanding that the landscape was always this way. They were simply looking at it through the wrong window. Jacqueline continued. She placed the photographs I had taken on the table, Carol's handwritten note, the asset worksheet, the email from Richard Howe dated before the layoff. She read Carol's note aloud calmly, the way you read a weather report. Better to move now while he has nothing to negotiate with. Don't wait. Helen Park, the mediator, looked at the note. She looked at Carol. She made a small notation on her pad. Carol's face had gone entirely white. Not red, not flushed. White. The bloodless pallor of a woman watching a strategy she designed get disassembled in front of her with surgical precision by people who were not angry, who were not vindictive, who were simply thorough, which she was beginning to understand, was worse. The mediator called a 30-minute recess. Richard Howe stood immediately. He walked to the far side of the room with Vanessa and Carol. Terrence followed. I could hear them talking, voices low, the acoustic quality of people recalculating. Jacqueline and I sat in our seats. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The document was doing exactly what she had designed it to do. Not attacking, not accusing, reflecting. Showing the room its own reflection and letting each person decide what they saw. Terrence came back to the table before the recess ended. He stood across from me with his hands in his pockets, looking at me the way you look at a building you've driven past 1,000 times and never noticed had a top floor. You had all of this the whole time? I looked at him. I had all of this the whole time. He shook his head once, slowly, the particular headshake of a man who is not disagreeing but absorbing, recalibrating, filing away the understanding that the man he had been patronizing at holiday dinners for a decade was the wealthiest person at the table and had never once mentioned it. He walked back to his side of the room. I sat in the silence and thought about my father, about the blue line, about $62,000 a year in a uniform he pressed every Sunday night, and a man who never once in his life felt the need to tell someone how much he was worth because he already knew, and knowing was enough. When they returned, the terms had changed completely. Richard Howe's voice was subdued, the voice of a man who has been professionally humbled and is working hard to make the humility look strategic. He proposed a revised settlement, equitable division of all disclosed marital assets, including the Blackwell holdings, using standard Illinois formulas. Vanessa would retain her pharmaceutical retirement accounts. I would retain the Blackwell operating structure, client relationships, and intellectual property. The house would be listed for sale, proceeds divided according to contribution percentages determined by the forensic accountant's report. No punitive claims from either side. No alimony from either side. I looked at Jacqueline. She reviewed the terms. She gave a small nod. I accepted. The signing took less than 15 minutes. Pages turned. Pens moved. The court reporter's keys clicked with the steady, neutral cadence of a machine that records without judgment, which is more than most of the humans in its vicinity could say. When the last page was initialed, Vanessa stood. She gathered her things slowly, the way a person moves when they are trying to hold themselves together and the effort of holding is taking everything they have. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at Terrence. She walked to the door, and at the door she stopped. She did not turn fully around. She spoke facing the hallway, her voice quiet but clear, reaching me the way sound carries across water. "Why didn't you tell me, Elliot?" I looked at the back of her head, at the careful hair, at the navy suit, at the woman I had loved without condition for more than a decade and who had set conditions on me from the day we met. "Because you never asked," I said. "In 11 years, you never once asked what I was doing when the house went dark. You never asked what was on my laptop. You never asked how I spent my time or what I cared about or what I was building. And you never asked because you had already decided the answer couldn't possibly matter. Not once, Vanessa. Not once in 11 years did you look at me and think, maybe there's something there I haven't seen." The hallway was quiet. The rain hit the windows. The court reporter's machine had stopped. She stood there for a long time. Long enough that Carol shifted in her chair and Terrence looked at the floor, and Richard Howe closed his binder with the deliberate care of a man who wanted to be holding something. Then she walked away. Her heels clicked once, twice, 3 times on the hallway floor, each click a little softer than the last, until the sound faded entirely and the door at the end of the hall opened and closed, and she was gone. I sat in that conference room for 5 more minutes. Jacqueline packed her files. The mediator made her notes. The rain continued. I looked at my father's cufflinks, small silver rectangles, his initials, J.M. James Mercer. The man who drove the blue line and pressed his uniform on Sundays and told me once, over breakfast in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and maple syrup, that a man's worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it, but by the things he builds when no one is watching. I pressed my thumb against the engraving. I breathed. Just breathed. Then I stood up, put on my coat, and walked out into the rain on LaSalle Street, into the wet, gray, beautiful, indifferent city, carrying nothing but my briefcase and my father's cufflinks and the quiet, undeniable, bone-deep knowledge that I had never, not for one single moment, been as small as they needed me to be. The divorce was finalized in 4 months. Illinois moved efficiently. I moved to a loft apartment in the West Loop, 2 blocks from the river with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced east and filled the rooms with the kind of morning light that feels like a daily argument for being alive. I bought a drafting desk at an estate sale and set it by the largest window. I bought a reading chair from a retired furniture maker in Pilsen, who told me he'd built it from black walnut and that it would outlast me, which he said not as a warning, but as a compliment to the chair. I put my father's cufflinks in a small wooden box on the shelf above the desk. I put my mother's framed photograph next to them. Blackwell Analytics continued to grow. The Pinnacle cold chain contract delivered 2 weeks ahead of schedule and $80,000 under budget, which generated 3 referral contracts in the first quarter alone. By spring, I had hired 2 junior analysts, a young woman from Northwestern named Priya, who treated data the way a surgeon treats tissue, with precision and respect, and a young man from DePaul named Marcus, who asked more questions in his first week than most people ask in a year and who reminded me, in ways I didn't mention to him, of myself at 27. I moved Blackwell out of my mother's P.O. box and into a real office on West Randolph Street, glass door, my name on it, both names, Elliot Mercer, Blackwell Analytics, founder. The first time I unlocked that door with my own key and walked into that office and stood in the empty space with the morning light coming through the windows and the city moving below, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring. Never the first, because she had told me once, years ago, that answering on the first ring makes people think you were sitting by the phone, and she wanted me to know she had a life. We both knew she'd been sitting by the phone since I texted her I'd call. That was the deal between us, the performance of independence, the reality of absolute devotion. I described the office to her, the windows, the view, the way the light hit the desk in the morning. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Your father would have stood right at that window, right where you're standing. He would have looked out at all of this and he would have said, 'Well, it's about time they caught up to you.'" I laughed. She laughed. And for a moment the distance between the West Loop and Joliet collapsed entirely, and we were just a mother and a son standing in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and maple syrup, and the only thing between us was love. And love was enough. And it had always been enough. And the only people who didn't know that were the people who had never taken the time to look. Arthur Devereaux invited me to First Meridian's annual private client reception in May. Black tie, rooftop terrace at the Peninsula Hotel. The kind of event where the appetizers come on slate boards and the bartender knows the difference between 9 kinds of bourbon and the handshakes are worth more than the watches on the wrists making them. I wore a new suit, dark navy, well-fitted, nothing extravagant. My father's cufflinks. I stood at the edge of the terrace with a glass of something I held but barely drank and watched the city unfold below me. The buildings and the river and the lake beyond, black and vast, holding the reflected lights of a skyline that looked, from that height, like something a child would draw if you asked them to draw the future. Arthur found me near the railing. He introduced me to a small group of clients and colleagues, choosing his words with the care of a man who understands that introductions in this context are not social gestures but endorsements. "This is Elliot Mercer," he said, founder of Blackwell Analytics, one of First Meridian's most valued private clients. He built his company from the ground up while working a full-time job, and he did it so quietly that the people closest to him didn't know until it was already done. A man in the group, older, silver-haired, kind eyes, holding a bourbon he was nursing with the patience of someone who had learned that the best things in life improve with slowness, looked at me and said, "That's either the loneliest success story I've ever heard or the bravest." I looked at him. I thought about the guest room, the buzzing kitchen light, the 9 to 1 in the morning hours, the French press with the cracked handle, the parking lot at the Walgreens, my mother's kitchen table, my father's cufflinks, Vanessa's laugh. Both, I said. It was both. I saw Vanessa one more time. It was June, a Saturday morning, early summer in Chicago, the kind of day the city earns by surviving everything that comes before it. Warm, bright, generous, the air carrying the particular lakefront sweetness that makes you forget, briefly and completely, that this same city will try to freeze you to death in 4 months. I was at the farmer's market in the West Loop, buying tomatoes from a woman who grew them in Kankakee and who described each variety with the passion and specificity of a person introducing you to members of her family. "This is the Brandywine," she said. "She's temperamental, but worth it. And this one, the Cherokee Purple, she'll surprise you." Vanessa was standing 2 stalls down, alone, holding a paper bag of peaches. She wore a white blouse, simple, no structure, no armor, flat shoes, no jewelry. Her hair was down. She looked like a person I had never met, or more accurately, like a person I had always suspected was there and had never been allowed to reach. Someone who existed beneath the blazers and the posture and the performance. Someone who had been hiding for so long she had forgotten she was hiding. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. The market moved around us, flowers and bread and voices and a child carrying a sunflower taller than she was, and we stood still inside all of it. 2 people holding the full weight of a shared history in a public place, trying to figure out which version of themselves to be. I walked over. She didn't step back. She didn't put on her professional face. She just stood there holding peaches, looking at me. "How are you?" I asked. And I meant it. I genuinely, fully, unreservedly meant it. She looked down at the bag in her hands. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said. "Twice a week since February." She told me slowly, carefully, with the precision of someone repeating words she had rehearsed, but that still cost her something to say out loud. "My therapist says I spent most of my marriage performing a version of myself that was designed to meet my mother's expectations. That I confused that performance with love. That I never learned the difference between the person my mother needed me to be and the person I actually was, and that the distance between those 2 people is where my marriage went to die." She paused. The market moved around us. Someone was playing guitar near the entrance, something soft and unhurried. The kind of music that exists to fill space rather than command it. She also said, "I owe you an apology, that no amount of therapy will make adequate, but that the attempt itself matters. That saying it, even imperfectly, even late, is better than carrying it in silence for the rest of my life." She looked up at me. "I'm sorry, Elliot. Not for the divorce. I think we both know that needed to happen. I'm sorry for the way I saw you. I'm sorry I made you invisible in your own home. I'm sorry that I let my mother's voice become louder than my own, and that I used her framework to measure a man who deserved to be seen on his own terms. I'm sorry I never asked what you were building. I'm sorry I laughed the night you told me the worst news of your professional life." Her voice thinned. Not breaking, but thinning, the way a wire thins under tension. I have thought about that laugh every single day since October. I will think about it every day for a very long time. Because that laugh was the most honest thing I said to you in years. And the honesty of it is the part I can't forgive myself for. I didn't laugh because I was cruel. I laughed because I had spent so long believing you were less than me, that when something bad happened to you, my first instinct was recognition, confirmation. And that instinct, the fact that it lived in me, the fact that I built it and fed it and never questioned it, that is the thing I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to understand. The market kept moving. The guitar kept playing. The child with the sunflower walked past us again, going the other direction now. The flower bobbing above the crowd like a small, bright, unjudgmental witness. I looked at Vanessa, and I let myself feel everything she was saying. The weight of it, the lateness of it, the realness of it. The fact that it was arriving now after everything, after the documents and the lawyers and the revelation and the rain on LaSalle Street, and the fact that its lateness did not diminish its truth. Apologies don't expire. They just accrue interest. "I forgive you," I said. I said it slowly. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted the words to carry their full weight. I don't say that because it's easy. I say it because carrying this is heavier than letting it go, and I am done carrying things that don't belong to me. I carried your mother's opinion for a decade. I carried your brother's pity. I carried your silence. I'm setting all of it down, right here in this market, next to the tomatoes and the peaches and the kid with the sunflower. I'm setting it down and I'm walking away and I'm not picking it back up. She nodded. Her eyes were bright. She held them. She held them the way I had learned to hold things over the past 8 months. With effort, with dignity, with the understanding that some things need to be felt completely before they agree to leave. "I wish I had seen you," she said. "I know," I said. "But I see me now, and it turns out that was always the part that mattered." I walked home from the market that morning with a bag of tomatoes and the kind of lightness that doesn't come from happiness exactly, but from something sturdier, something load-bearing. The feeling of a house whose foundation you've checked and double-checked and know with total certainty will hold. Not because it was built expensively, but because it was built honestly, one piece at a time in the hours when no one was watching. That evening, I sat at my drafting desk by the east window. The sun was going down over the city in layers of copper and rose and violet, the kind of sunset that looks like someone is being generous with it, like there's more than enough beauty for everyone and the sky is trying to prove it. I opened my laptop. The Blackwell Analytics dashboard. 31 active clients. 2 full-time employees. A revenue projection for the fiscal year that would have made the version of me standing in that kitchen in September, the one holding the spatula, the one watching his wife laugh, the one eating dinner standing up because sitting alone felt like a surrender. That version of me would have dropped his spatula. I closed the laptop. I picked up my phone. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom. Hey, baby. You eat?" "I ate," I said. I lied. I was about to eat. I was going to heat up leftover pasta and sit at this window and watch the last of the light disappear and be, for the first time and as long as I could remember, completely, fully, unapologetically at peace. "Your father's anniversary is next week," she said. "You coming down?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll bring flowers. Bring the good ones. Not the gas station ones." I laughed, a real laugh, a warm one, the kind that rises from somewhere that has nothing to prove. "I'll bring the good ones." A pause. The kind of pause that holds 10,000 things without naming any of them. The kind of pause that exists between two people who have survived the same story and don't need to tell it anymore because the survival itself is the telling. "I'm proud of you, Elliot. I've always been proud of you, but I want you to know I'm especially proud of the man you became when nobody was looking. That man is my favorite one." I set the phone down after we said goodnight. I sat in my reading chair, the black walnut one, the one the furniture maker said would outlast me. I looked out at the city. The last line of light was disappearing behind the buildings, thin and gold and precise, the kind of ending that looks exactly like a beginning that hasn't announced itself yet. I thought about my father, James Mercer. Blue Line. 33 years. $62,000 in his best year. A uniform pressed every Sunday night. A man who never raised his voice, never demanded recognition, never once in his life told another person how much he was worth, because he carried his worth inside him like a compass and he didn't need anyone else to confirm which direction was north. The last thing he said to me, sitting in his bed in the apartment in Joliet, his hand in mine, his voice thin but absolutely certain, the voice of a man who had lived his entire life according to a single principle and was leaving it the same way, was this: "Don't ever let them measure you, son. You are not a number. You are the whole damn equation." I kept those words. I kept them the way you keep something precious, not on display but in a safe place, somewhere deep and quiet and entirely yours, where the people who underestimate you can't access them, and the people who love you don't need to see them because they already know they're there. And on those nights, the 9 to 1 in the morning nights when the house was dark and the work was hard and the woman in the next room had made it clear one more time that I was less than she believed she deserved, I would sit at my laptop and I would build, line by line, client by client, dollar by dollar, hour by quiet, invisible, unrewarded hour. And I would hear my father's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me in that blue CTA uniform with his coffee and his patience and his absolute, unshakable, non-negotiable belief that his son was enough. I was enough. I was always enough. The people who couldn't see it were never the ones who got to decide. If you are listening to this, and you are the one who builds in the dark, I want to speak to you directly, and I want you to hear this all the way down to the floor of wherever you are standing. You are not invisible. You are in progress. And progress doesn't owe anyone a performance. The spreadsheet you fixed at midnight, the meal you made that no one thanked you for, the fence you repaired, the bedtime story you told, the savings account you quietly grew while someone in the next room decided you weren't enough. Those things are not small. Those things are the architecture of your life, and the people who can't see it yet are not the ones who get to decide what it's worth. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. Tonight. Find one thing in your home that you built, fixed, kept, or held together when no one asked you to. A worn cookbook. A repaired chair. A light bulb you finally changed in a hallway that had been dark for months. A child's drawing you framed because it mattered to you even if it didn't matter to anyone else. Sit with it. 1 minute. Don't explain it. Don't justify it. Don't measure it against someone else's version of success. Just look at it and know with the same certainty you use to know your own name that it is yours, that you made it, that it exists because you showed up. That is where your worth lives. Not in someone's recognition, not in a settlement offer, not in the laugh of a person who never learned to look closely, not in the approval of a mother-in-law who measured you against a standard she never bothered to define, not in the pity of a brother who thought $19 an hour was doing you a favor. It lives in the quiet hours, in the work no one sees, in the company you built while they were sleeping, in the hands that made dinner even when no one sat down, in the cracked handle you repaired because replacing it would have meant giving up something that was yours, in the light that buzzed above you while you worked, patient and persistent and indifferent to whether anyone else was paying attention. And when the world catches up to you, and it will, because it always does, because the math always arrives, you will not need to raise your voice. You will not need to perform. You will not need to explain yourself to anyone. You will simply be standing there, at the window, in the morning light, exactly where you always were, finally seen, by the only person who ever needed to see you, yourself.